Before sunrise on June 26, 1876, a strange silence settled over the ridges above the Little Bighorn River. The grass moved softly in the wind. Smoke drifted above a vast village in the valley. Horses grazed near the water, and somewhere beyond the bluffs, wounded soldiers whispered for help that might never come. Only hours earlier, more than 600 men of the United States 7th Cavalry had ridden into this country with confidence. Their commander was George Armstrong Custer, one of the most famous officers in America. He had survived the Civil War. He had led cavalry charges through cannon smoke. Newspapers had turned him into a symbol of courage, ambition, and victory. But now 5 of his companies had disappeared. No messenger had returned from Custer. No bugle answered from the northern ridge. No one among the surviving soldiers knew exactly where he was, what he had seen, or whether a single man from his command was still alive. Across the river, thousands of Lakota, northern Cheyenne, and a small number of Arapaho people were preparing to leave. They had defended their families, their horses, their homes, and a way of life being crushed from every direction. Their warriors had achieved one of the most complete victories ever won against the United States Army on the Great Plains. Yet even they could not know what that victory would bring. The battle would soon be called Custer's Last Stand. Paintings would show one heroic final circle. Films would turn confusion into legend. Politicians would use the dead to demand revenge. For generations, the story would begin with Custer and end with Custer. But the people who lived beside the river remembered another name. They called it the Battle of the Greasy Grass. And to understand what happened there, we must look beyond the final hill. We must follow the trail of broken treaties. We must enter the sacred Black Hills. We must hear the warnings of scouts who understood the land better than the officer they served. And we must return to the moment when a commander looked toward an enormous village, divided his regiment, and ordered an attack before he truly understood what was waiting for him. Because the Battle of the Little Bighorn was not simply the story of one man making one fatal mistake. It was the collision of 2 worlds. One was expanding with railroads, telegraph wires, military forts, miners, settlers, and laws written far away. The other was fighting to remain free on land where family, hunting, ceremony, memory, and survival were bound together. On June 25, 1876, the expanding world expected the older one to scatter. Instead, it turned and fought. Long before Custer rode toward the Little Bighorn, the northern plains were already a living world of nations, trade routes, alliances, rivalries, sacred places, and remembered trails. The land was not empty. The Lakota had moved westward onto the plains over generations. The horse transformed their lives, making it possible to travel farther, hunt buffalo more efficiently, protect large camps, and move with the seasons. The buffalo provided meat, hides, clothing, shelter, tools, and fuel. But it was more than a resource. It stood at the center of spiritual life, identity, and responsibility. The northern Cheyenne also lived through movement, horses, family, and the buffalo. The Arapaho were part of this complex human landscape as well. These nations traded with one another, intermarried, formed alliances, and sometimes fought. Their political worlds were not controlled by a single ruler. Leadership depended on respect, courage, generosity, spiritual authority, and the willingness of people to follow. Among the most influential Lakota leaders in 1876 was Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa leader known for courage, generosity, political judgment, and spiritual power. He was not a battlefield general issuing orders to every warrior. No one person commanded the entire village in the way a United States officer commanded soldiers. But Sitting Bull represented resistance. Crazy Horse, an Oglala Lakota war leader, had become famous for bravery and calmness in battle. Gall, another Hunkpapa leader, carried enormous influence. Northern Cheyenne leaders such as Two Moon and Lame White Man would also play important roles. There were many others. Most would never become famous outside their own people. On the morning of June 25th, they did not wake as characters in an American legend. They woke in a village. Children played near the lodges. Women prepared food, repaired clothing, cared for families, and worked among the horses. Men visited relatives, discussed rumors, and watched the surrounding country. Thousands of horses grazed along the valley. Smoke rose through the cottonwoods. The camp stretched for miles beside the winding river. This was not a military fortress. It was a community, and that fact shaped everything that followed. The road to the Little Bighorn began with agreements that failed. In 1851, the United States met with several Plains nations near Fort Laramie. American officials attempted to define territories, protect travel routes, and reduce conflict. But settlers continued moving west. Wagon roads crossed hunting grounds. Military forts appeared. Buffalo herds were disturbed. And the discovery of gold created new waves of migration. By the 1860s, one of the most disputed routes was the Bozeman Trail, which crossed important hunting lands on its way to the Montana gold fields. The United States built forts to protect the trail. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors resisted. The conflict became known as Red Cloud's War. In December 1866, warriors destroyed a force led by Captain William Fetterman near Fort Phil Kearny. All 81 men in the command were killed. The United States eventually agreed to abandon the forts. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 recognized the Great Sioux Reservation, including the Black Hills, for the Lakota. It also described a large area west of the reservation as unceded hunting territory. For a brief moment, it appeared that armed resistance had forced the United States to retreat. But the peace did not last. American officials expected Native people to abandon the buffalo hunt, settle near government agencies, become farmers, and depend on federal rations. Many Lakota and Cheyenne families had no intention of surrendering their freedom so easily. Then came the Black Hills. To the Lakota, the hills were sacred. They were tied to origin, ceremony, identity, and memory. To many Americans, they became valuable for one reason: gold. In 1874, an expedition led by George Armstrong Custer entered the Black Hills. Miners accompanying the expedition found signs of gold, and the news spread quickly. Almost immediately, prospectors poured into land the United States had promised to protect. The government did not remove them. Instead, officials attempted to purchase the hills. Lakota leaders refused. The Black Hills were not simply property with a price. Negotiations failed. Then government policy hardened. Late in 1875, Native families living away from reservation agencies were ordered to report to those agencies by January 31, 1876. The demand arrived during winter. Many bands were hundreds of miles away. Travel with children, elders, possessions, and large horse herds was slow and dangerous. Some people may never have heard the order in time. When the deadline passed, the government classified those who remained outside as hostile. With one bureaucratic word, families following the buffalo became military targets. The Army planned a 3-column campaign. Colonel John Gibbon would approach from the west. General George Crook would advance from the south. General Alfred Terry, accompanied by Custer and the 7th Cavalry, would move from the east. The columns were meant to close around the Lakota and Cheyenne, prevent their escape, and force them onto the reservations. On a map, the plan looked like a trap. On the ground, it meant hundreds of miles of rough terrain, uncertain information, exhausted horses, swollen rivers, deep ravines, and an enemy who knew the country. Then, 8 days before the Little Bighorn, the campaign began to break apart. On June 17th, Crook's column encountered a large force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors near Rosebud Creek. The battle lasted for hours. Crook was not destroyed, but he was stopped. He withdrew to rest and resupply. Most importantly, Custer did not know Crook had been turned back. When the 7th Cavalry approached the Little Bighorn, Custer believed another major army force was still moving from the south. It was not. The trap was already incomplete. Inside the native camp, the Rosebud victory strengthened confidence. Around the same time, Sitting Bull took part in the Sun Dance. Later accounts described a vision of soldiers falling upside down into the village. The vision has often been presented as a precise prophecy of Custer's defeat. Native spiritual traditions, however, should not be reduced to a simple prediction created for modern storytelling. What mattered was the feeling surrounding it. The soldiers were coming. The people had been promised victory if they remained united and avoided arrogance. But many in the camp still did not believe the army would attack such an enormous gathering. An Oglala warrior named Low Dog later remembered his disbelief. They were too numerous, he thought. No commander would be reckless enough to attack them there. He was wrong. George Armstrong Custer was 36 years old. During the Civil War, he had risen rapidly. He was brave, energetic, theatrical, and willing to take risks that other officers avoided. He cultivated an image. His long blonde hair, red scarf, buckskin clothing, and dramatic battlefield presence made him easy to remember. His admirers saw fearless leadership. His critics saw ambition and recklessness. Both views contained truth. Custer could inspire men through personal courage. He could also drive them hard, punish them harshly, and gamble with their lives. In 1868, he led an attack on a Cheyenne village along the Washita River in present-day Oklahoma. The camp belonged to Black Kettle, a leader who had repeatedly sought peace. The attack killed warriors, but women and children also died. Custer left the Washita with greater fame. The Cheyenne remembered something else. By 1876, Custer's reputation was complicated. He had recently angered President Ulysses S. Grant through testimony criticizing corruption connected to the administration. Grant initially tried to keep him away from the campaign. Only after political pressure was Custer allowed to return to the 7th Cavalry. The expedition offered him a chance to restore his prestige. On May 17, 1876, the 7th Cavalry left Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. Families watched the regiment right away. The column contained more than 600 soldiers, along with scouts, civilian employees, pack animals, and a newspaper correspondent named Mark Kellogg. Many enlisted men were immigrants. Some had years of military experience. Others were poorly trained. Their main weapon was the single-shot Springfield carbine. It was powerful and accurate, but every round had to be loaded by hand. Some native warriors carried repeating rifles. Many carried older guns, revolvers, bows, lances, and clubs. The Army's advantage was discipline and organized ammunition supply. The warriors' advantage would be numbers, mobility, knowledge of the ground, and the speed with which they could respond once their families were threatened. On June 21st, General Terry met Custer and Colonel Gibbon near the mouth of the Rosebud River. The plan was simple in theory. Terry and Gibbon would approach the Little Bighorn from the north. Custer would follow the native trail south, then swing west toward the river. Terry expected cooperation, but Custer's written orders allowed flexibility. He was also offered additional troops and Gatling guns. Custer refused them. The guns were heavy and would slow his movement. He believed speed mattered more. He also believed the 7th Cavalry could defeat any force it found. That confidence had history behind it. Large native villages often scattered when soldiers approached. Surprise attacks had succeeded before. Custer did not think he was riding toward annihilation. On June 22nd, the 7th Cavalry separated from Terry and began following a broad trail up the Rosebud. The signs were enormous. Abandoned campsites, fire remains, lodge poles, thousands of pony tracks. Custer pushed forward. Before dawn on June 25th, scouts climbed to a high observation point. Far to the west, through haze and distance, they detected smoke and the pale shapes of an immense horse herd. Custer reportedly struggled to see what they saw. The scouts understood the ground more clearly than he did. They knew the village was extremely large. Mitch Bouillet, an experienced interpreter and scout, is said to have warned that the camp contained more people than Custer had ever faced. Crow scouts prepared themselves for death. Some changed out of army clothing and put on traditional dress. They had read the trail. They knew what waited beyond the hills. Custer had considered hiding through the day and attacking the next morning. Then reports arrived that the regiment had been discovered. He faced a dangerous choice. Wait, and the village might scatter. Attack immediately, and his men would enter the valley tired, divided, and without complete information. Custer chose speed. Near noon, he divided the 7th Cavalry. Major Marcus Reno received 3 companies, around 140 men. Captain Frederick Benteen received 3 companies and was ordered to search the high ground to the south and west. The pack train, carrying ammunition and supplies, fell behind. Custer kept 5 companies, a little more than 200 men. Dividing cavalry was not automatically foolish. Commanders often separated units to search, flank, and attack from multiple directions. But every division created distance. Distance delayed messages. Distance made support uncertain. And Custer still did not know the true size of the village. A report reached him that the native people were fleeing. It was probably mistaken. What soldiers may have seen were loose horses, scouts, or families moving within the enormous camp. But the report confirmed Custer's fear that the village would escape. He ordered Reno forward. Reno was to cross the river, charge the southern end of the camp, and bring the people to battle. Custer promised support from the whole command. Then Custer turned north along the bluffs with his 5 companies. Reno rode toward the river. The Little Bighorn curved through a green valley bordered by cottonwood and willow. Beyond the river, the land rose into ridges cut by hidden ravines. The Iroquois scouts moved ahead. Shots were exchanged. Reno formed his companies and advanced across the valley floor. For a brief moment, the southern edge of the village lay exposed. Then the alarm spread. Imagine the sound arriving before the meaning. Hooves striking dry earth. Gunshots beyond the lodges. Dogs barking. Women calling children. Men reaching for weapons. Horses pulling against ropes. The attack had not fallen upon soldiers waiting in formation. It had struck a village filled with families. At first, confusion moved through the camp. Some people fled. Women and children moved away from the gunfire. Others began, releasing horses before the soldiers could capture them. Warriors rode toward the southern end. The village was so large that people at the northern end may not have known an attack had begun while Reno was already fighting in the south. Reno advanced only a short distance before the number of warriors in front of him began increasing. He ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line. Soldiers opened the breeches of their carbines, inserted cartridges, fired, and loaded again. Warriors moved across their front using speed and the folds of the ground. Some fired from horseback. Others dismounted and used the terrain for cover. The village was no longer fleeing. It was awakening. Gall later said members of his family were killed during the opening attack. For him, the battle became personal within minutes. Crazy Horse prepared to enter the fight. Groups of warriors formed around relatives, friends, and warrior societies. They did not wait for a single general to give one universal order. They responded where the danger appeared. Reno watched his position weaken. Warriors threatened his left side and moved through the brush near the river. He ordered his men into the cottonwoods. The trees offered concealment and a temporary defensive position. For a time, the soldiers might have held there. But Reno had almost no information. He could not see Custer. He did not know whether Custer had crossed the river farther north. He did not know how many warriors were moving toward him. Then a bullet struck Bloody Knife, an Iroquois scout standing near Reno. Bloody Knife was hit in the head. The violence of the moment seems to have affected Reno deeply. His orders became confused. First, he ordered the men to mount, then to dismount. Finally, he ordered them to leave the timber and reach the bluffs across the river. What began as a withdrawal became a collapse. Soldiers and scouts burst from the trees. Horses crowded together. Men lost weapons, hats, and control of their animals. Warriors pursued them across the open ground. Some native witnesses later compared the pursuit to a buffalo chase. Men were shot, struck, or pulled from their horses. Some never reached the river. Others drowned or were killed near the bank. A number of soldiers remained trapped in the timber because they had lost horses or never heard the order. Reno reached the bluffs with part of his command. He had entered the valley with around 140 soldiers. Within a short time, dozens were dead, wounded, or missing. The survivors climbed onto high ground and looked north. They expected to find Custer. But Custer was already moving into the most mysterious part of the battle. After separating from Reno, Custer rode north along the eastern bluffs. The high ground concealed him from much of the village. It also concealed much of the village from him. No soldier from his 5 companies survived to explain his exact plan. Everything known about the Custer fight comes from the landscape, archaeology, the location of bodies and cartridge cases, messages sent before the collapse, and accounts given by native participants. Those witnesses saw different pieces of a fast-moving struggle. Their memories do not always agree. The final movements must therefore be described carefully. Custer appears to have searched for another crossing where he could strike the village from the center or north. Perhaps he hoped to capture women and children, forcing the warriors to surrender. Perhaps he intended to attack while Reno held attention in the south. But from the bluffs, Custer finally saw more of the camp. The lodges continued far downstream. The village was not scattering. It was enormous. Custer sent messengers south. Trumpeter John Martin carried the most famous note. Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. The repeated request for the packs meant ammunition. John Martin survived because the message carried him away from Custer. Custer then moved toward a drainage later called Medicine Tail Coulee, which led down toward the river. Some native accounts describe soldiers approaching a ford there. Whether Custer intended a full crossing, sent only a small group forward, or was simply examining the river remains debated. What is clear is that resistance was forming. Warriors who had driven Reno away began moving north. Others from the central and northern parts of the camp rode directly toward Custer. Reno was no longer the main danger. Custer was. The 5 companies moved away from the river and back toward higher ground. Perhaps Custer understood that a crossing was impossible. Perhaps he intended to regroup. Whatever the plan, the initiative was slipping away. The same ridges that had hidden his approach now hid the warriors gathering around him. Custer's battalion stretched along a long ridge. The companies were separated across the terrain. At the southern end, near what became known as Calhoun Hill, soldiers dismounted and formed defensive lines. The carbines began their rhythm. Fire. Open. Load. Close. Aim. Fire again. For a time, parts of the line held. Archaeological evidence suggests organized resistance in several places. The soldiers did not all run immediately, and the battle was not one motionless circle around Custer. It spread across ridges, ravines, and slopes. Warriors tested the line. Some carried repeating rifles. Others carried single-shot weapons, revolvers, bows, or clubs. Mounted groups moved rapidly around the soldiers while other warriors used ravines to approach unseen. Dust and smoke narrowed every person's vision. A soldier might fire at a rider, look down to reload, then discover warriors appearing from another direction. A warrior might enter the smoke without knowing whether the next shape was a soldier, a relative, or a riderless horse. At Calhoun Hill, the cavalry position began to fail. Company L appears to have fought in an organized line before being overwhelmed. Once that section collapsed, the rest of the ridge became vulnerable. Miles Keogh's company, I suffered heavily. Keogh died near several of his men. His horse, Comanche, was later found wounded but alive and would become famous as a supposed lone survivor. But Comanche could not explain what happened. The soldiers fell back toward the northwestern end of the ridge. At first, the movement may have been controlled. Then units mixed together. Officers lost contact with men. Horses broke loose. Warriors entered the gaps. No single dramatic moment ended Custer's battalion. The defense broke in pieces. Company E, known for its gray horses, may have moved toward a deep ravine. Men died far from the final hill. Others attempted to escape on foot. Some gathered around officers. Some fired until they were surrounded. Warriors pressed between the separated groups. The remaining soldiers gathered near the place later called Last Stand Hill. Custer was there. His brothers Thomas and Boston were also there. So were his brother-in-law James Calhoun and his nephew Henry Reed. The name Last Stand suggests a long and deliberate final defense. The reality may have been much faster. Once the line broke, native accounts often described the ending as brief. Soldiers fired from the hill and from behind fallen horses. Warriors closed from several directions. Custer died from gunshot wounds. Exactly who killed him is unknown. There is no reliable evidence for the dramatic speeches, personal duels, and heroic final poses invented later. The truth is quieter and more terrible. A command of more than 200 men ceased to exist. Within perhaps an hour of the main fight, all 5 companies had been destroyed. But the battle was not over. Reno's survivors were still on the bluffs, and Benteen was approaching. Benteen had completed his reconnaissance without finding a fleeing village. Turning back toward the main trail, he received Custer's message and increased his pace. Then he encountered Reno's shattered men. Some were wounded. Some had lost horses or weapons. Many were close to panic. Reno called for help. Benteen stopped. That decision became one of the greatest controversies of the battle. Custer had ordered Benteen forward. But Reno, the senior surviving officer, needed immediate support. Had Benteen continued north, could he have saved Custer? The timing makes it unlikely. By the time he reached Reno, Custer's companies may already have been collapsing. Benteen remained until the pack train arrived. The ammunition mules had fallen behind, and soldiers struggled to drive them over the ridges. From the north came heavy gunfire. Captain Thomas Weir, anxious about Custer, moved toward the sound. Other companies followed. They reached a high point now called Weir Point. In the distance, they saw dust and smoke over the ridge. They may have seen mounted warriors moving across the battlefield. Then those warriors turned toward them. Reno and Benteen withdrew to a stronger position. By evening, the surviving portion of the 7th Cavalry formed a defensive perimeter on high ground east of the river. They dug shallow pits with knives, cups, and whatever tools they could find. The wounded lay near the center. Medical supplies were limited. Their greatest suffering came from thirst. The river was visible below them, but warriors controlled the approaches. Men could see water they could not reach. As darkness arrived, the firing slowly decreased. Across the valley came the sound of singing, drums, celebration, and mourning. Some soldiers believed the sounds meant Custer had been defeated. Others still expected him to appear. No one knew. Below them, native families searched for missing relatives. The village had survived, but everyone understood that more soldiers would come. At sunrise on June 26th, the battle resumed. The Reno-Benteen position was stronger now. The companies were concentrated, and ammunition had arrived. Warriors fired from surrounding ridges. At times, they charged close. Soldiers defended the perimeter while wounded men waited for water. A group of volunteers began making dangerous trips down toward the river with canteens. Every journey brought only a small amount. For the soldiers on the hill, time stretched. For the village, time was running out. Scouts reported another army column approaching from the north. This was the combined force of Terry and Gibbon. The Lakota and Cheyenne had won the battle, but remaining in one enormous camp would be dangerous. Ammunition had been spent. Families were grieving. Horses, children, and elders needed protection. During the afternoon, warriors began leaving the fight. Lodges came down. Belongings were packed. Thousands of people and animals moved south along the valley. From the bluffs, soldiers watched the great village slowly disappear. The withdrawal was not panic. The village had achieved its immediate purpose. It had survived the attack. There was no reason to remain and face Terry's approaching troops. By evening, the Greasy Grass grew quiet. Reno and Benteen still did not know what had happened to Custer. On June 27th, soldiers appeared from the north. At first, the exhausted defenders feared another attack. Then they recognized army uniforms. Terry and Gibbon had arrived. Terry expected to find Custer somewhere nearby. Instead, soldiers discovered bodies on the ridges. The dead stretched from Calhoun Hill along Battle Ridge to Last Stand Hill and into the ravines. Some lay alone. Others were gathered in clusters. Every soldier in Custer's immediate battalion was dead. On June 28th, the army performed hurried burials. Most men were placed in shallow graves near where they had fallen. The ground was hard. The work was difficult. The wounded were carried toward the steamboat far west. Captain Grant Marsh pushed the vessel down the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers with extraordinary speed. On July 5th, the far west reached Bismarck. The news spread by telegraph. Its timing gave the defeat enormous symbolic power. The United States was celebrating its 100th anniversary. Then came word from Montana. Custer was dead. 5 companies had been destroyed. One of America's most famous soldiers had fallen to people many citizens had been taught were destined to disappear. Newspapers competed for dramatic details. Early reports were often wrong. Numbers were exaggerated. Illustrators who had never seen the battlefield created heroic images of Custer standing in the center of a shrinking circle, firing until the last moment. The real battle had stretched across miles of ridges. The real Custer had cut his famous long hair before the campaign. But the painting was easier to remember than the confusion. For decades, the phrase Custer's Last Stand became a story of heroic sacrifice. The Lakota and Cheyenne victory was treated not as the defense of a village, but as a national humiliation demanding revenge. The victory at Little Bighorn had been complete on the battlefield. Strategically, it brought a storm. More troops entered the region. Military columns pursued Lakota and Cheyenne bands through summer, autumn, and winter. Soldiers attacked camps, destroyed lodges, captured horses, and burned food. The government used hunger and rations as weapons. In 1876, Congress moved to seize the Black Hills and other lands without receiving the consent required by the treaty. The hills that had helped cause the war passed into American control. The people who had won at the Greasy Grass scattered into smaller groups. This made survival possible, but it weakened their ability to gather a force as large as the one at Little Bighorn. Some surrendered at agencies. Others continued resisting. Crazy Horse came to the Red Cloud Agency in May 1877 with followers exhausted by hunger and war. A few months later, during a struggle while under military control, a guard stabbed him with a bayonet. Crazy Horse died that night. He was probably in his mid-30s. Sitting Bull led followers north into Canada. There, he hoped to remain beyond the reach of the United States. But buffalo became scarce, food became difficult to obtain, and the Canadian government offered little support. In 1881, Sitting Bull returned and surrendered. The victory beside the Little Bighorn had saved the village on one summer day. It could not stop the full weight of the United States government. The battle also left survivors searching for someone to blame. Marcus Reno was accused of cowardice for retreating from the valley and failing to reach Custer. Frederick Benteen was criticized for stopping with Reno instead of riding immediately toward Custer's message. Both men argued that the situation made any rescue impossible. The debate continued because Custer could never explain his plan. The dead commander became whatever later generations needed him to be. To admirers, he was a brave officer abandoned by subordinates. To critics, he was reckless, arrogant, and responsible for dividing his force. To native families, he was the commander of an attack on their village and part of a larger campaign against their freedom. The real man resists simple judgment. Custer was brave. He was experienced. He was also ambitious. He underestimated the village. He attacked with incomplete information. He divided his regiment before discovering the enemy's true strength. His decisions mattered, but focusing only on Custer can hide the larger truth. Even if he had waited for Terry, the campaign still aimed to force Lakota and Cheyenne people onto reservations and open their lands to American expansion. The battle did not begin because one officer was reckless. It began because Native independence had become unacceptable to the United States government. For many years, the battlefield was organized almost entirely around the dead of the 7th Cavalry. White marble markers showed where soldiers had fallen. A monument rose above their mass grave. The place was called Custer Battlefield National Monument. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors had no equal memorial there. The imbalance reflected the story the nation had chosen to tell. That began to change. In 1991, the site was renamed Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. An Indian memorial was dedicated in 2003, honoring Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho participants. Red granite markers now stand at several places where Native warriors are believed to have fallen. The old military monument remains. So does the Indian memorial. The landscape asks visitors to hold more than one memory at the same time. A soldier can be mourned without turning an attack on a village into a noble mission. A warrior can be honored without pretending victory prevented the suffering that followed. The land can remember both death and survival. Today, the ridges above the Little Bighorn appear quiet. Wind moves through the grass. The river bends through the valley. From Last Stand Hill, the distances seem small, but the ground folds into coulees and ravines that hide movement until it is close. That terrain explains part of the battle. It does not explain everything. No one knows every order Custer gave. No one knows the exact moment he understood the size of the force. Around him, no one knows who fired the shot that killed him. And no single witness saw the entire battlefield. History must be assembled from fragments. A message carried away by a trumpeter. Cartridge cases left in the grass. The memories of warriors. The testimony of surviving officers. The location of the dead. The silence of those who never returned. But some truths are clear. The village beside the Greasy Grass was not waiting for war. It contained families. The army attacked because the people living there refused to surrender their freedom. Custer believed surprise, speed, and aggression would cause the camp to scatter. Instead, the defenders gathered faster than he expected. Reno's attack collapsed. Custer's isolated battalion was surrounded and destroyed. Reno and Benteen survived on the bluffs. The Lakota and Cheyenne won the battlefield. Then the United States used the defeat to intensify the campaign that took their land. This is why the Battle of the Little Bighorn remains larger than the legend of one final hill. It was a victory. It was a tragedy. It was an act of resistance. And it was the beginning of a harsher war. History remembers Custer's last stand because an entire command vanished. But the deeper story belongs to the people who were supposed to vanish instead. They did not disappear that day. When the soldiers entered the valley, the village turned to meet them. Families escaped. Warriors defended the river. The 7th Cavalry was stopped. And for a few hours beneath the Montana sky, a people marked for surrender proved that history had not yet defeated them. The United States would take the Black Hills. It would force most of the free bands onto reservations. It would transform the battlefield into legend. But it could never erase what happened beside the Greasy Grass. Custer rode into the valley expecting the village to run. The village stood. And by the time he understood the difference, it was already too late.